I tried to be the kind of woman you wanted me to be, and it's not your fault that I tried.
I'm Pamela Harris, and I produced the Women's Kit. At that time, I was working at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education in the Department of Computer Applications, which was very strange because I didn't know a thing about computers, but I was working with a couple of guys, David Stansfield and Anthony Barton, who had started a new sort of multimedia kit. And they had made a free-form kit called the 30s kit. Well, it was 10 years in a box, but it was the 30s kit. And after we did a number of kits together, ecology, perception, etc., I then proposed to do a kit on women. At that point in time, in the 60s, 70s, there was a lot of ferment in education. There was a movement towards free schools, towards questioning the rigidity of the school system. So the idea of these kits, and as you can see from this massive stuff behind me, which is a very small amount of what was really in the kit, they weren't little boring things. And they tended, particularly the way David and Anthony instituted them, to be very wild and woolly. So you didn't have a teacher's guide that said, do this, and now they will learn that. The whole idea was you immersed students in not data, but a kind of visual, oral experience that they would dig into and have questions and develop ideas. Now, the women's kit was much less free-form than the earlier ones because, well, we'll be very frank, I did have an agenda. This was in a way a consciousness-raising package for young men and young women in high schools and colleges. So we were trying to raise questions and show things that they might not have really connected with. There's an awful lot in the kit that's about translation, like, here's an ad. Well, what's it really saying to you? Here's some school materials. What are they saying about girls or boys? Here's the law. Here are the laws on marriage. Well, in those days. What did they say about a woman's place or power or whatever, and a man's? But just to go back to the kits, therefore, with the women's kit, once it had been distributed the first time round and was then published and sold, it did have a teacher's guide. But the teacher's guide didn't say, do X, Y, and Z. They suggested connections and things. So I think these multimedia kits, these kits in the hands of a really good teacher could be incredible. But particularly the earlier ones, like the perception bag and the ecology box. The ecology box was huge. We did it with UNESCO. That if a teacher wasn't up to it, my guess is that it might have turned into a lot of wonderful posters on people's walls. In 1972, although the women's movement was happening, there really weren't materials for schools. There weren't books around here. There was The Lace Ghetto, which was a wonderful book. So there was a need for this. There was a need. And as women in the women's movement, we particularly wanted to reach, or at least I did, to reach younger women, right? It's their world. It was scary because I felt it was a very big responsibility. And it was obviously beyond a person. To start with, I got permission to go ahead with this. Problem, at OISE, I was merely a researcher. I wasn't an academic at OISE. Therefore, all I got for doing this was my salary was continued, and we had a print shop in the basement. So we made most of this stuff ourselves in the basement. And of course, I had been doing this for years, so I knew where to go to get records made and film strips and stuff like that. The beginning was really a process of thinking about what I wanted to have in it, and then networking. And then it obviously became a collaborative process. What did lots of people think would be good to have in it? There are obvious things like marriage and your name. Like, do you change your name? Witches, women and psychology, so forth. Then various people took on things, or people came along and said, I want to do X, and then they did them. I'm sure that one of the first people I reached out to was Angela Miles, who I had known ever since before she was a feminist. So from Angie, other people, Maggie Feldberg, who was a teacher, connected us, wrote pieces, but also connected us with some students. Now, after about 6 months, I asked for help. I asked Oise for help, and they said, no, we can't let you hire anybody, but here's someone who's working in another area, and we don't need that, so she can come work with you. And that's how Becky came on it. And Donna Pothar, who's also called Donna James, she was the secretary to our area. So we just, we did all our own typing, and she and she was one of the people who made the kit. And it was Becky particularly who did the distribution, and Donna, and then others who came along. So we networked, and what I would say, all I could offer people, because I didn't have funding, I could offer people the chance to be part of making this happen. And that's how it really came to be, that lots of people got involved because they wanted to help make it happen. So the Federation of Women Teachers gave us a grant. So they gave us $2,500. That was a lot of money. It was enough to hire Claire Watson Garcia as an illustrator. And so all these wonderful pictures on, like, the record of a girl in training school, or the cover of the box, or this on names. Yes, we did a thing on names. I was really into that. It was a point when I went back from being a McLeod back to Harris. Claire did those, and she added so much to the kit. And my memory is that the Federation of Women Teachers even got in trouble because they'd given us money because we were perhaps subversive. I left just when the kit was printed, not because I wanted to, but because I had a Canada Council grant to photograph in the Arctic. And this was something I was really committed to. And I was building a darkroom in the Northwest Territories which turned into a darkroom for an Inuit women's group, and doing photography and teaching it up there. And I had to use that grant or lose it. So I asked for 3 months off, and Oise wouldn't give it to me. So I sadly had to leave before it was distributed, the women's kit. And that was a huge loss. That was a huge loss to me, because it's like working on a stage production for a year and a half and then not getting to be on stage, or not getting to see it through. It's like having a baby and then not having it around. But that was fine. There it was, and I got to do both. You asked about the process of actually making these things. Chaos and overtime. So really, most of it was done at Oise. So this is a time of, electronic typewriters. And some of it was reproduced from other things, or we just copied. And sometimes you'd have some wonderful illustration by Claire, and we would go down to the basement, and we had a great relationship to the printing department. I always had. And in fact, I mean, way back with the perception bag, we put all of this together ourselves, a lot of it, and this one too. So we would go down, we would choose the colors of paper, we would da-da-da-da. It was very hands-on. And if Becky wanted to do something on witches, she went off and did her thing on witches. She was the one who went up and collected some images from the archives, and we did one of our film strips on that. Film strips were, in the olden days, half-size slides, and you ran it through a film strip projector, so we had things like that. The idea was multimedia. You had the visual, you had the records, and you had the art. We had slides of women artists. And then, very often it was, well, I know I worked, if I got home by 10 o'clock at night, I was a lucky girl. Woman, excuse me, I don't use that term anymore. Only since I had children do I use that term. I was a lucky woman. So one of the things that was fun with Women's Kit was to take some of the and there was backlash, of course, to take some of the backlash and then analyze it. Now, I love this. This was 1972 in the Toronto Star. Women themselves will kill women's lib. So he wrote how women, because they didn't agree, because there were different theories and ideas in the women's movement, they were going to fight like cats, as if you couldn't, in a complex movement, change of the way people think, you couldn't have different points of view, and you couldn't debate them. So we could take something like Braithwaite being a fool, and then Angela Miles could analyze it and talk about the women's movement. Here's a record, little teeny weeny record from the olden days when this is a record, girls and boys. This is a really 35 RPM, but it looks like a 45, meaningless to you. But anyway, so that was a record done by a student, a high school student, who was a student of one of the women, Maggie Feldberg, who contributed. So Karen and her boyfriend selected some of the most sexist lyrics of the time, and then played it a little bit, and then he read it. And he just read it in his voice, like she selected, and had him read what these wonderful groups that we all loved, like the Stones and the Beatles and some of them, were actually saying to us, just to remind us where we're at.
We got a lot of little teenage blue-eyed groupies who do anything we say.
We got a lot of little teenage blue-eyed groupies who do anything we say.
So some of the material in the kit, in addition to the record, there's a piece called You Are What You Play about toys, and that was done by a student. I remember at one point I wanted to do a piece on starting your period. And so we had a kind of drop-in invite, whatever, no email, so called people and got a bunch of women there at Eve Zaremba's place at DuPont and Avenue Road. It was called the Women's Place. And people came and just we talked about starting your period. Now, it was shocking that there were still people, including one fairly young woman, who had started her period without knowing what it was. I couldn't believe it. I mean, that happened to my grandmother, for goodness sakes. But, you know, that was a long time ago. So it was just amazing. Anyway, we didn't actually use, I think I might have taped that, but I didn't actually end up using it because it got so personal, it wasn't comfortable. And maybe I didn't tape it, I don't even remember. But we did have a piece in called, I put it in called rite of passage, and talking about that this is an event, this is a big event, and in many places it's celebrated, or in some places becomes oppressive to women. But anyway, one of the coolest things that we did for the Women's Kit was to get in touch with Nell Hull-Humphreys. Now, she had been referenced in the book The Lace Ghetto, and she was one of the original suffragettes. She had been a young girl in Britain during the fight for getting the vote, and I did a record, which was the interview with her.
See, we had so many men against us that you'd sometimes wonder if, you'd all be dead perhaps before anything really happens. And I think that's why I felt that burning things wasn't a wrong thing to do, because men are more concerned about property than they are about people. And of course, the insurance people also were very concerned.
She is so wonderful. And to hear her very lovely sort of proper accent talking about, her mother putting the brick through the big plate glass window, and etc., the various fires. These women were something else. And I remembered when I was a kid that in our history classes we might see little speeded up pictures of the suffragettes marching. I always found them embarrassing. They seemed so funny and silly. No, they weren't. They were really revolutionary. And one of the things Nell gave us, she gave us the original of the letter she wrote from jail to her father, articles about her being force-feeding. And we had all that in the kit. We had a list of all the women who were arrested and so forth. So that was a great connection. And somehow also, I don't know who connected me with this woman, but there was a young woman who'd been in training school who got in trouble with the law. And we did a whole series on that. And that's another record.
They teach you there that you are bad, that society doesn't want people like you, that you're no good, and you're never going to amount to anything. They tell you about Vanier and about Kingston's own penitentiary and everything. And they say, well, this is going to happen to you, stuff. They say, once you start out as a criminal and go to training school, you're automatically going to end up in a penitentiary, and you're going on and on. So it makes you look at yourself like a piece of rot,
That was a very interesting connection. So it was fun, You can't have revolution if you don't have fun. I think that's true. There was a fervor about many issues. Remember, there was the war in Vietnam, there had been the civil rights movement, and the women's movement, like those others, had the feeling that we could and were changing the world, which of course turns out to be much of an illusion, but not totally an illusion, because all those little things you do add up. So there was an enthusiasm and an excitement about what we were thinking, what we were realizing. It's very hard now to even get your head back in a time when you never saw women much, say, in the news. Reading the news or being in the government. And it really was another world. You asked me about currents in the women's movement. There were many, but I don't think there was so much sense that what is your theory and what group were you in. Everyone was doing everything all the time at once. And there was a sense in that period, if there's something you want to do, you do it. You want to start an art gallery on Baldwin Street, somebody starts an art gallery. You want to make a photo magazine, someone starts a photo magazine. The baby boom bulge was there, and there was so much youth, and therefore youth energy was everywhere. And also, it was a better economy. There were fewer people. So, but I think it's still possible. I think when you want to do something, you just go ahead and do it, and then figure out how after all. The phrase sisterhood is powerful. I don't think that just means that if a bunch of us get together, we're powerful. I think it means that the concept of sisterhood between women is a very potent idea. The fact that there are women suffering from fistula in Africa is for me an immense feminist issue. I feel for those women. And of course, I feel for anyone who suffers. But the injustices that poor women or women in incredibly oppressive male societies are suffering is an issue for all women. I think women need to be faithful to one another. I think that there are, in some ways, there are societies, there are countries who are more oppressive to women now than they were 40 years ago. I know that. And why? Partly, some of that could be reaction to our movement. The women's movement is the ultimate challenge to the original injustice or disparity in our species. This is big, and I personally don't think you can even solve the environmental crisis we're in without somehow changing that mindset.
Smiling face, shining hair, clothes that I thought you'd like me to wear. Made to please, but not to tease. It's the custom